Welcome to this time of what in normal times would be our midweek communion. I want to begin by sharing with you some assumptions I have about you and about me and about our time together. One assumption is that if you are watching this, either when it is first aired or at some later time, that you and I are not together by accident. You have deliberately chosen to be here. And further, if you did not consciously choose to watch this video, you and I are still not together accidentally. I believe that sacred entanglement has arranged this meeting. Yet another assumption that I have is that you are really familiar with the stories that have been appointed from our tradition for this particular week. They are probably the most memorable, well-known stories from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And I want to read them to you in their entirety, and then I would like to offer a brief reflection on these stories and their relevance for us. And I've chosen to read the stories from a rendition of our scripture that was done by Eugene Peterson. The first reading is from Genesis. Meanwhile, Jacob had settled down where his father had lived, the land of Canaan. This is the story of Jacob. The story continues with Joseph, 17 years old at the time, helping out his brothers in herding the flocks. These were his half-brothers, actually, the sons of his father's wife, Bilhah and Zilpah, and Joseph brought his father's bad reports on them. Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he was the child of his old age, and he made him an elaborately embroidered coat. When his brothers realized that their father loved him more than them, they grew to hate him. They wouldn't even speak to him. His brothers had gone off to Shechem, where they were pasturing their father's flocks. Israel said to Joseph, "Your brothers are with flocks in Shechem. Come, I want to send you to them." Joseph said, "I am ready." He said, "Go and see how your brothers in the flocks are doing and bring me back a report." And he sent him off from the valley of Hebron to Shechem. A man met him as he was wandering through the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" "I'm trying to find my brothers. Do you have any idea where they're grazing their flocks?" The man said, "Well, they've left here, but I overheard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph took off, tracked his brothers down, and found them in Dothan. They spotted him off in the distance. By the time he got to them, they had cooked up a story, a plot to kill him. The brothers are saying, "Here comes that dreamer. Let's kill him and throw him into one of these old cisterns. We can say that a vicious animal ate him up. Then we'll see what his dreams amount to." Reuben heard the brothers talking and intervened to save him. "We're not going to kill him. No murder. Go ahead, throw him in the cistern out here in the wild, but don't hurt him." Reuben planned to go back later and get him out and take him to his father. When Joseph reached his brothers, they ripped off the fancy coat he was wearing, grabbed him, and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was dry. There wasn't any water in it. Then they sat down to eat their supper. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites on their way from Gilgad with their camels loaded with spices and ointments and perfumes to sell in Egypt. Judah said, "Brothers, what are we going to get out of killing our brother and concealing the evidence? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites, but let's not kill him. He is, after all, our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. By that time, the Midianite traders were passing by. His brothers pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took Joseph with them down to Egypt. The next reading is from Matthew, and it also is one with which you are very familiar. As soon as the meal was finished, he insisted that the disciples get in the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the people. With the crowd dispersed, he climbed the mountain so he could be by himself and pray. He stayed there alone late into the night. Meanwhile, the boat was far out to sea when the wind came up against them, and they were battered by the waves. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. They were scared out of their wits. "A ghost," they said, crying out in terror. But Jesus was quick to comfort them. "Courage, it's me. Don't be afraid." Peter, suddenly bold, said, "Master, if it's really you, call me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come ahead." Jumping out of the boat, Peter walked on the water to Jesus. But when he looked down at the waves churning beneath his feet, he lost his nerve and started to sink. He cried, "Master, save me." Jesus didn't hesitate. He reached down and grabbed his hand. Then he said, "Faint heart, what got into you?" The two of them climbed into the boat, and the wind died down. The disciples in the boat, having watched the whole thing, worshiped Jesus, saying, "This is it. You are God's Son, for sure." Now, I want to offer you some brief reflections on these two stories and how I think they are relevant for us in this time. Who of us with any church background doesn't know the story of Joseph and his coat of many colors? As a matter of fact, Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber made it even more popular and well known with their musical Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. When I first entered religious studies in the midst of the 1950s, my professor of Old Testament, as the class was called, was Dr. Kyle Yates, a very sophisticated, tall man with a beautiful, full head of gray hair. He was one of the translators of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, and he also served as a consultant to Cecil B. DeMille on the movie The Ten Commandments. I remember when that movie first came out, we went to Dallas to see it, and we all thought it was such a wonderful film. And now when it's shown at Easter season, we all think it's such an awful film. But Dr. Yates was the one who told us in Hebrew studies that in Hebrew there is no word for a coat of many colors. When King James had this Bible translated in 1611, having a coat with long sleeves did not indicate anything of any status. So the translators simply made Joseph to have a coat of many colors. Well, not only was Joseph special to his fathers, but the long sleeves meant that he was exempt from any labor. He didn't have to tend to the fields. He didn't have to be shepherd with his brothers. And his business about interpreting his dreams and bragging that someday he would lord it over his brothers, that didn't make him set well with his brothers. Maybe he was naive about all of that. He was unaware of the resentment that built up in them, enough so that they wanted to kill him. I'm giving Joseph a break. He was just barely out of adolescence. He did not see or had been taught that claiming his special status was going to give him any kind of trouble. He didn't realize that his brothers were on the bottom of the social economic heap, and he, being born of a different mother and in kind of a different family, was on the top of the economic and the social heap. He had no idea how his brothers felt about him. He was unaware that he was walking into an ambush. And if it had not been for the quick thinking of one of his brothers, he would have been dead. Actually, that brother may not have been so merciful, as he was greedy about wanting the money that would come from the sale of Joseph. Now, you don't, I hope, need for me to draw parallels between this story and our time. After the murder of George Floyd, as well as the revelation of so many other black lives needlessly taken, we have walked into a situation that we should have seen coming, but which, on the other hand, has hit most people like a bolt out of the blue. Most social commentators are saying that we've reached a tipping point in the arena of racial justice and equality, and things can never go back to the way that they were. The Joseph stories were created as part of a larger saga in the telling of the story of Jacob and the creation of the nation of Israel. Even more, they were created to tell that Israel's identity was one that was gained from their relationship to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now again, I'm assuming you know this story. In Egypt, Joseph goes on to find favor with Pharaoh. He's put in charge of the food supply. He had a dream that predicted there was going to be a great famine that was coming. Indeed, that famine did come. Joseph's brothers came to Egypt when they were suffering food insecurity. They don't recognize Joseph, but he does recognize them. He has an opportunity to get revenge, but he doesn't take it. Rather, he sees an opportunity for reconciliation, and he takes that. Further, he sees this as a circumstance in which God's will has brought him and his brothers to this moment for this purpose. Again, the application to and for us is clear. We are being given this moment in history to bring into being an enactment of who we say we are, a people committed to liberty and justice for all. The story from the Jesus narrative, I think, is equally relevant for this moment in our collective lives. There is so much in this brief story. It is so rich. I can't go into all of it, but I just want to give you one little brief reflection on it. Jesus has sent his disciples to the other side. Now, if you take a bird's eye view of the entire Jesus narrative, you can see instance after instance where either Jesus himself or he orders his disciples to cross over to the other side. Jesus is all about crossing over, breaking down boundaries that separate people from each other and people from God. It's the kind of thing that got him killed. And in this story, in the process of crossing over, it's a turbulent one. The boat in which the disciples are riding is storm-tossed. Now, folks, this is a parable. After death and resurrection, though the followers of Jesus did among themselves experience and express joy and forgiveness as a community of people, they were ostracized, they were persecuted. Their Jewish brothers and sisters didn't understand the direction in which they were taking their religion. The Roman government didn't accept their unwillingness to give allegiance to the emperor. They were not experiencing smooth sailing. Again, the parallels are pretty obvious. The other night, thanks to Tim Leatherwood, who's been doing such a wonderful job keeping us connected as a community of faith during this pandemic, we watched a video of one of the worship services from St. Paul's from about a year ago. I was so glad to get to do that. It wasn't the same as being immersed in the actual event, but it was so comforting to go through the ritual, to see the choir process in, to hear the readings and the hymns. And if you've been in St. Paul's Cathedral and looked up at the ceiling, you recognize that you are looking at the inside of the bottom of a boat, the ship of the church. We're storm-tossed right now. We've even been tossed out of the boat. You know, we've been planning for over a year now to bring Dr. Jackie Lewis here to do a workshop in October. She's not coming now, at least not in person, but we will have her in a webinar. And when I was talking to her earlier this week about the event, I asked her when the church where she serves would be open. It's Middle Collegiate Church in Manhattan. And she said, not until sometime next year. I don't know about you, but I grieve what we can no longer do. And as someone trained in psychology, it's humanly impossible not to have some anxiety about what will be. In this story, his disciples see Jesus walking on the water coming towards them, which they don't first recognize him. They cry, "Is it you?" They cry out for help. Now, the implication here is that it takes some work for us to see Jesus. It takes some faith for us to see Jesus. And We have to not allow our fears to get in the way. I want you to notice that at least in this instance, Jesus does not calm the storm, at least not initially. What he says is, "It is I, be not afraid." That's one of the most frequent phrases in all the Bible. When there is an unveiling of the sacred or people see the sacred, the words are uttered, "Fear not, be not afraid, I am with you." Joseph says to his brothers, "Don't be afraid. God brought us to this moment." Now, I don't believe there's a God out there who has a stick that stirs things up occasionally on the earth, but I also don't believe that there's no moment where God is not present. We just lose sight of that, especially in stormy times. Jesus wants to come to us during this stormy time, not to calm the storm, but to calm us, to give us that blessed assurance that though God protects us from nothing, God sustains us in everything. Jesus asks us to have the faith to go beyond where we are, and when our faith is frail, he reaches out his hand to take us. That's the reason the stories like the ones we've reflected on were created by our mothers and fathers in the faith. It's the reason that they have been retained as part of our collective identity and memory. And it's the reason that we have been given this opportunity to reflect on them. So hear sacred mystery as she comes to us in the person and presence of Jesus, say to you, as if you were the only one, "Fear not, be not afraid, I am with you, take my hand, let's go forward." In the name of the Creator and the Redeemer and the Life Giver, amen.